Welcome, everyone. I think I have, did you say 3.5 hours to speak? The doors are locked and the windows are sealed, so you're in here for a while. No, I think I have an hour, and part of which I want to have clearly for a question and answer period, because I think it's important, right, for a number of reasons. But before I start, I have a couple of things I want to do here. Before I start, let me say, on the weekend, or Monday, I guess it was, I received an article from the Cape Breton Post referring to an outspoken theologian visiting Cape Breton and having me say relatively nasty things about Pope Benedict. Well, let me clarify it. I'm quite capable of saying nasty things about Pope Benedict, and I have, but these weren't the words that I said. And more importantly, to the point, I'm not a theologian. I'm an English professor who is co-assigned to the Department of Religious Studies, and I chair the Department of Religious Studies. Now, I have taught in faculties of theology in Texas and in Ottawa and in Toronto and whatnot. So I work within faculties of theology, but I work as somebody in that area of interdisciplinarity between the religious and the aesthetic sensibility, and then the area of biography and spirituality. So it's understandable that somebody might conclude that I am a theologian. What was surprising about the article, and I only say this just to correct it, is that nobody talked to me about it. Usually a reporter phones you and asks you a couple of questions, and then the article appears. But this one, who is, by the way, nameless, didn't bother to do this. Accessed information on the website, which is either out of date or inaccurate, and so created a bit of a problem. But I always feel that in these things, there's no such thing as bad publicity. Any publicity that brings anybody out to hear a talk on Catholic social doctrine's got to be good. So even if they've got it all wrong, got the name wrong and everything else, in the end, what is important is that people come and hear something about this great treasure in the life of the church. And we're talking about it most specifically in the context of the life of one individual, and that is Greg MacLeod. That's the whole point of this. But let me tell you just one thing you might find amusing. I'm accused of attacking the Pope, saying that he had the ethical intelligence of a child to make the comment that he did about Islam. I never said that. What I said was that that what was said was staggeringly stupid. And this got me into a lot of trouble because Brian Bethune, who is a wonderful man, he's the books editor of Macleod's magazine, and very highly educated. He's a doctorate in medieval studies from the University of Toronto. But somehow or other, my words got elided with somebody else's. You know, those little dots that appear. And as a consequence, the ascription to the comment, staggeringly stupid, of Benedict was ascribed to me. And so I went on air with the CBC. I wrote my column in the Globe and Mail, tried to clarify that I didn't say that. But it was several years later, the nuncio, the Pope's representative in Canada, was having a meeting with me. I was president of the Canadian Association of Catholic University Presidents, and there was about 22 or 24 of us. And after everybody left, he said, "Dr. Higgins, I wonder if you would stay behind for a minute. We have a file on you." And I said, you've had a file on me for years. That's never bothered you before. He said, "Well, this one we have to talk about. And is it true that you said the Pope was staggeringly stupid?" And I said, I clarified that on the CBC and in the Globe and Mail, so I don't know why this continues to survive. But here's the explanation. I said that when the Pope made his decision to give his Regensburg address, you may remember this, it was very early on in his pontificate, and he was going to speak about Islam and Christianity. And he said some things which were both ahistorical and most certainly imprudent. And I said the failure of the Secretaries of State, Angelo Sodano and Tarcisio Bertone, to vet the document and advise against its being delivered was staggeringly stupid. So he said, "So you're saying the cardinals, the Secretary of State, are staggeringly stupid?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Well, that's quite all right." He didn't like either of them. And he's now nuncio in Paris, so he knew who he was going to support. Right? So we got that finally cleared up. So whoever hunted this down using some spurious source like LifeSite News was digging up stuff that is in fact fake news. Okay, it's just simply not true. Okay. I came to not to Cape Breton, but to Nova Scotia in the 1960s, late 1960s, to study at St. Francis Xavier University. I was a Canadian, Torontonian, and this was not expected to be my path in life, to go to Nova Scotia. There were 4 seminarians. We were all Torontonians, and we arrived in Antigonish in 1966. And one of my colleagues got off. It was a Sunday afternoon, and so there was nobody anywhere. And he turned and he said, "Where's the subway station?" and, and I said, "I don't know a lot, but I think there isn't one." I don't think there's a subway station. Well, there weren't a lot of other things as well. And I remember on one occasion, and I know he's just fairly recently deceased, and was one of the most impressive professors I had, and in later years became a friend, Rod B. MacDonald, in a class that he was lecturing on, referred to the 4 of us as Upper Canadians. Okay, we thought that was a sign of praise, right? We had no idea that it was a Nova Scotia phrase for abuse. So we thought, this is wonderful. So we started going around the campus, "Hello, we're Upper Canadian." Until somebody, I don't know, it was Rod McSween, said, "Michael, you know, that's really pejorative. I wouldn't go around telling everybody." I said, "It's not a good thing." "No, it's not a good thing." So I learned pretty quickly that there are some things that we brought from the center of the universe, and Toronto still, by the way, thinks of itself as the center of the universe, that maybe we should have left home. But one of the things that we didn't leave home was all 4 of us fell in love with Nova Scotia and with the Maritimes. 3 of us moved back to Ontario in various ways. 1 did not. And we have been connected, certainly my family, my wife and I, with the Maritimes through my presidency at St. Thomas University in Fredericton, but numerous other occasions coming back to St. FX to lecture and what. And it is a special pleasure to come back to Cape Breton Island. I was here a long time ago giving a lecture at CBU, though I don't think it was called that then. I think it was the University College of Cape Breton or something. And it was at the invitation of Charlie MacDonald, and his friends Ralph Mackay and Peter Kavanagh were here. And Peter was working with the CBC at the time. Later he would go back to Ontario and he would be associate producer for Peter Zosky, and then up until his retirement he was executive producer or senior producer for Michael Enright. And we co-wrote the book, actually, Suffer the Children Unto Me, a critical examination of the clerical sex abuse crisis. But we met here. We met here in Cape Breton. And Ralph Mackay, who had been in a house, a religious house in Antigonish, was an old friend and remained, baptized one of our children and remained close to us for the 30-odd years that he was resident in Toronto. And Charlie MacDonald and I occasionally crossed paths over the years as well. So there is a special visceral connection to Cape Breton University. It just simply isn't, well, come down and give a talk to yet another university. When I was president of St. Thomas, they would rotate, the AAU, the Association of Atlantic Universities, we would rotate in different universities. And one of the really pleasant ones was when we were here at CBU, and we were at the Native Communities Place, and it was a wonderful occasion. So when I have been back, it's always been a joy. I say this because it was in my last year at St. FX that I met Greg MacLeod. If we're going to give a lecture on Greg MacLeod, we should start with him, right? And we're going to end with him as well. I met him, and he was giving a class, actually, on the British empiricists. All right? And it was a third-year class, right? And we gathered. He had just come back from the University of Louvain in Belgium, where he was full of ideas. And he was always full of ideas, as you know it, okay? And he had been hugely influenced by François Huttard. The Abbé François Huttard was a great figure in the extraordinary explosion of ideas that was going on at the university at the time as they attempted to find points of intersection between the social sciences and the humanities, breaking out of the existence of these discrete areas of studies and trying to find ways to have economics and sociology and political science in conversation with theology and history and English and philosophy. And François Huttard played that role. Georges-Henri Lévesque played the same role in the Graduate School of the Social Sciences at Laval University, and around the same time. Very important things were happening in Catholic scholarship and in Catholic ideas. And it was a fluorescence. It was a wonderful coming together. Now, this is an important thing. When Greg was there, other people who were there were the likes of Ron Roheiser. Now, Ron Roheiser is the premier spirituality writer in North America. And it is always a bit of a shock to the Americans. I love this. I teach for him every year. We have an arrangement. I go down. I teach for 2 years. You have to excuse us, the flight. I teach for 2 weeks every year in June in San Antonio, which is an experience that is quite comparable to hell because it's a bad time for the heat. It's 104, 106 every day, so but it's the only time when I can teach this course. So I do, and he's a Canadian, of course. We know all this. He's from the prairies, from Saskatchewan. But it's always a huge illumination for the class, a big epiphany to discover that this man whom they love, and people come from all over to study under, or to read, or spend some time at the Oblate School of Theology, that you discover he's a Canadian. But he was at Louvain with Bob Boulogne. Bob Boulogne is recently deceased, sadly, chaplain at Yale University. And this was when Greg was there. This was, these things often happen, where you have a concatenation of bright lights and exciting energy, a confluence of all kinds of people doing different things. And they may not even be aware of it. Like they wouldn't necessarily know who was doing what. Wonderful biblical scholars, great philosophy scholars, all gathered there at this rather famous university at a really critical point in the life of the Church after the Second Vatican Council. One of the things that he would have picked up, and one of the points that would have been a source of great energy for him, and which he carried in his own reflections as a thinker, was a strong commitment to the writings of such figures as E.F. Schumacher. Schumacher, of course, is the author of Small is Beautiful. I was thinking of choosing that as my autobiography title, but my wife dissuaded me. And Lady Barbara Ward, an eminent British economist and Catholic, interested in a close relationship between the poor nations and the rich nations of the world. Also, of course, as a confluence of figures not so much centered in the European context, but in the local context, were people like Moses Cody. It is impossible to talk about Greg without understanding something of his intellectual provenance. Where did he get his ideas? How were they articulated? Who inspired him? There's no question that Greg has inspired a large number of people in an ever-widening circle. But he didn't live in isolation. There were people who inspired him. They generated his own generosity, if you like, of heart and vision. People like the Sandersons, and very importantly, Andy Hogan. Andy was a priest and economics professor and member of Parliament. He was an NDP member of Parliament for a number of years, and he writes about the importance of Moses Cody in his own thinking. And you can see in Hogan's writing, and he would have been an early contemporary of Greg's, you can see, again, a symmetry of ideas and personalities coming together at an exciting time, but also a time of challenge and dissolution. So let's start off. I don't want to make this too academic, but I always think it's important to get some of the early points behind in our head about what these ideas are. What were the ideas? What was going on in the Maritimes, more particularly in Nova Scotia, most specifically in Cape Breton Island? Okay, what ideas were Germany? Because historians down the road, Canadian historians and others, are going to look back at this fluorescence of insight and new visioning in precisely the way it should be. This was an electrifying moment of new thinking. It was a bit like what you had in Britain entre la guerre, between the wars, when you had the development of Chesterton's notion of distributism and the ditchling community, various artists and economists and demographers and philosophers and poets and theologians coming together to try to work out a different way between capitalism and socialism. And that's what the Moses Cody movement was doing. The anti-globalization movement was trying to find a different way, a third way that even suggested by the papal encyclicals, we don't have to go either route, extreme statism or laissez-faire capitalism. There has to be something, particularly coming out of a tradition centered or rooted in the gospel, that provides a viable alternative. Well, here we are in the year 2017. We don't seem to be anywhere near that viable alternative, and the extremes now are worse than they ever have been. So we're actually in a more dramatically difficult situation of economic dissolution and challenge now than we have been before. But let's take a look a little bit at the before in order to begin to think about how, if we can continue the legacy of Greg MacLeod, we can address the now. Dr. Moses Cody was a priest and educator, as you know, whose impassioned plea has been recorded in a work called, by Alex Laidlaw, called The Man from Margaree. There, it's the quote. This is Cody. Let us not forget that to be condemned to permanent economic poverty and social insecurity threatens life itself, closes the road to culture, and stifles the very yearnings of the human for happiness. Let no one tell us that the material and economic is not their field or duty when it is a question of working our destiny here and hereafter. History confirms us in the conviction that if religion and Christianity are to flourish, we must not overlook the well-being of humans. We should learn well its lesson, allow the masses of the people to wander leaderless in the economic desert of waste and poverty, and inevitably they will turn from those men of religion who are satisfied to preach abstract justice and charity to those irreligious leaders who can, or at least say they can, solve the people's problems. End of quote. Now, doesn't this read with alarming resonance for our own time? Right? It would be, I live in the United States right now, so I spend a great deal of time in a sometimes dark place. And in the United States right now, with the coarsening of the language, the extreme alienation that has become a driving rhetorical and political reality in the country, contributes to precisely the kind of thing he's diagnosing here. When leaders, religious leaders, no longer have credibility, others fall, or political leaders, others replace them. It's George Steiner's brilliant notion in Nostalgia for the Absolute, which were the Massey lectures given in the early 1970s, when he says, you know, when you take Orthodox Judaism or you take Christianity and you gut them of meaning, you don't replace them with nothing. The vacuum will be filled, and they're filled with substitute or surrogate theologies. Now, his argument is so strong, he would make the case that much of 19th century progressive Judaism, or in the late 19th, early 20th century, became Levi-Straussism, but the earlier forms of Messianism and whatnot created Marx. That's his argument. That Victorian Protestantism, with its specific decline, also created the momentum for Darwin. Right? Now, this is not an argument to say all of these things are deplorable. They're not deplorable. The argument he's making is that when you remove a hegemonic orthodoxy or way of looking at the world, a cohesive way of looking at the world, a anthropology, an understanding of what it is to be human that falls into place, when you take that out, when you gut it, it's not as if something immediately replaces it. It certainly doesn't remain empty. What will replace it, the surrogate theologies, may well prove to be dangerously suspect. The political examples, of course, are many. After the collapse, and it's particularly timely now, given that just this month we'll be celebrating the 100th anniversary of the armistice, and then next year the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Versailles. And out of that came not a new world, but a new old world of pending horror. Okay? The Weimar Republic fell. Nobody was really ready for the League of Nations, and the particular punitiveness of many of the ruling nations made it impossible for Germany to rebuild with any sense of national integrity, and into that world moved the malcontents, most particularly a soldier who was a painter in Vienna from Linz. Hitler's rise was to no small part dependent upon the conditions of dissolution and despair and failure of the governance structure. That's what, although he's not using those particular dramatic examples, obviously, historically, he's making the point quite clear that if we don't do something, others will. So he goes on to say, and I think quite rightly, the formula for social construction was to be an adult education program for economic action on behalf of cooperative ownership, and the antagonist movement was to be the vehicle for the program whose goal was the achieving of the abundant life for all. Sounds like Pope Francis. We're all into this for the abundant life for all. Not the few, not the 0.001%, but for the all. The Cody formula for the antagonist movement included a plan for the building of cooperative business reorganizations, beginning primarily in the consumer sector and extending to the producer and service sectors of the economy. Greg MacLeod lived this out with New Dawn Enterprises and with its other initiatives. This was a way of enabling this theory of cooperation, economic freedom, and prosperity to exist in ways that didn't diminish your humanity. In this way, Cody envisaged that the common people could regain control over the means of production, distribution, and exchange which they had defaulted. As a consequence of this, and in the process of educating themselves, they would, he hoped, raise their consciousness and then proceed to reconstruct the entire social order in an evolutionary way along more humane and Christian lines. Pretty serious stuff, this. Cody's rallying call at a particularly difficult time, the rise of the social gospel, particularly driven by Baptists in the prairies, the emergence of equivalents in the United States during the time of the Depression, all speak to the fact that religious authorities were attempting to respond to increasingly straitened economic circumstances which diminish and crushed people. One of the ways that happens, of course, is the layering or the structuring or the putting in place of things that minimize our own ability to do something. Let me just reflect on that for a minute, to just show you some of the things he would have brought back from Louvain. One of the things that you see regularly, whether it's with the crafts shop, or whether it's a restaurant, or whether it's a home for the homeless, or whether he's planning to, revisit the railway in the province, or whether he's deeply involved in the creation and evolution of the former Xavier College into its subsequent iterations, Greg was concerned with the community of Cape Breton. He was concerned with the community of Cape Breton because he knew you always have to start from a specific nexus. Okay? He wasn't starting with Iceland. He wasn't starting with Afghanistan. He was starting with here. Okay? It had to be an intentional community. This is a community that needs to repair itself. This is a community that needs to be injected with hope. This is a community that needs to take ownership of its own future. Now, where do you think he gets these ideas? Partly, certainly, from Cody, but very importantly from his experience at Louvain. Who do you think was at Louvain, in addition to all the other ones that I've just been talking about? The future generation of liberation theologians. Gustavo Gutierrez, the now great and still living father of liberation theology, one time a priest of the Archdiocese of Peru, now a Dominican friar. He was a graduate student doing theology under Hutar in Louvain. Okay? And several other men from Latin America who would return to Latin America would bring back ideas, some of them generated by the Second Vatican Council, some of them created by some of the other events going on, the 1968 event with Puebla. All of these things are so very important, right? Because you bring these ideas back and then you begin to implement them. You begin to give them not a Eurocentric definition, you begin to give them a Latino-centric. In other words, you ground them in the experience of the lived political, social, and economic morality and situation that you find there. And what were some of those notions? Some of those notions that they were bringing back to effectuate and to realize in situations, of course, much more desperate than our own in many ways, but that he, Greg, would translate into experience here in Cape Breton. Well, the first, we are artisans of our own destiny. That's number one. We are artisans of our own destiny. Not CEOs in a big transnational corporation, not James Street in Montreal or Bay Street in Toronto, okay? Not the huge economic players, but we are the artisans of our own destiny. When you're not, when you're the global playthings of large international powers, the first thing that comes in is the utter depersonalization of the relationship, right? It is not possible if you're owned by Beijing and you're working in Akron, Ohio, that you're going to have the same relationship to the owner and to the worker, that critical dynamic, which is going to be important for a effective social community, as if the ownership was right there in Akron. Okay? There's buy-in. Whether it's buy-in by the corporation and with the workers, a real sense that you're an artisan of your own destiny. It means you're not the plaything at the whim and will of forces external to your social and economic nexus. Secondly, other liberationist principles. Conscientization. Conscientização. Actually, it's a Portuguese name. The word comes from Pablo Freire, the great pedagogue, and it basically means, and we use the term now in its English form to talk about when we reach a level of awareness. People become conscientized. We mean by that they look at reality in a new way. They see in a new way. It's like a new epistemology. Oh my God, I've been looking at this all my life and I didn't see what it means. It's a way of freeing ourselves from the subtle entrapments of biases and other things that lie to us. Okay? So when you're conscientized, you see things differently. Now, let me give you one example of this, and to show you how revolutionary it is, because you can't reverse it. I remember we taught a course called Women in the Church in the late 1980s, early 1990s, at St. Jerome's University and the University of Waterloo. I was the dean, and the president and I were doing it together, and we had 90 students, 89 of them men and one woman. Well, we thought we're going to change this. We're going to change this, and so over the years we ended up getting 50-50, right? And I remember the previous dean, who was himself a feminist, wonderful guy, psychologist, but he says, "I don't think you guys know what you're doing." He says, I applaud what you're doing. I'm glad you're the dean and I'm not the dean anymore, because the shit's going to hit the fire really quick soon. Because when you conscientize people, you can't take it back. Okay? When you teach people to see in a new way, a structured injustice, okay, a bias that's in the bloodstream, which you've never seen before, right? And it's exposed to you for the first time, and you're given a way of speaking about it. You're given the language. You're allowed to critique it. You don't go back and say, well, Well, that was that course. Now I'm going on to a course like what we taught was a course that resulted in conscientizing. And it does have results, both positive and negative. The positive, that people move forward with new energy to make change. The negative is they encounter such resistance, they become cynical. But the conscientization can't be bypassed. The preferential option for the poor, we've all heard this, but this is key to liberation theology. Greg MacLeod never had a preferential option for the rich. It was very clear where his heart went, okay? Where his heart went. And he understood this in the context not only of the gospel, but of the theology and philosophy he would have learned at Louvain. He also recognized the importance of indigenous autonomy as opposed to globalization. But this would have only been in its very earliest phases. I think now we often look at globalization as a good thing. Well, we did. Now we're not so sure. Okay, with NAFTA pretty well gone, with the new arrangement crafted by a lunatic on the Potomac, we're not sure how this is going to play itself out, right? And the arrangement that we're working in the Pacific, the difficulties with the huge number of tariffs on China. China could pull in the debt load at any time, and Washington could collapse. I mean, it's a very perilous situation, right? And so for all these particular factors, it's pretty difficult to talk about globalization as a necessary and self-evidently wonderful thing, okay? It's nuanced. If it's globalization in the sense that you have global awareness, it's a way to bring international exchange. It's a way to enhance trade that raises the collective boat for everyone. Yes, we'll go for that, you know. The imposition of tariffs, economic withdrawal into individual secure redoubts that resist other things, this is not good. But the kind of globalization that's unfolding is the kind of globalization that some of the earlier critics were more prophetic in anticipating would be deleterious rather than supportive. Enhanced surveillance, the reduction of the wage to a lower level, because economics very often travels to the points of least resistance. So one of the consequences of the NAFTA agreement, which we celebrate and shouldn't particularly, was the loss of a number of Canadian American jobs to the maquiladora on North Mexico, because the companies could shift the work significantly to the south, not pay the same wages, not provide the same benefits, do all the kinds of things that kept them at a certain particular economic level, but ensured the bottom line of their corporations would go up and up and up. And so there are ways in which globalization actually serves an elite. It serves those who best in the position to benefit from it. Right? So the complications around globalization are considerable. But we do know this, that when it crushes indigenous or local autonomy, turns the local economy into nothing, a service economy, to a larger behemoth, this isn't a good thing. And those are the kinds of things Greg would have fought. Globalization wouldn't have been part of his vocabulary in the early years because it wasn't part of any of us. But he would have known that this would have been a trend that would continue to diminish what happens in the local community. What firms would be gone, what industries would be closed, the impact that these would have on the social community. Because the social community, of course, is cohesive, it's of a piece. So I have a friend of mine is an Anglican priest, and he runs the Church of St. Aidan, which is quite an environmental church, actually, wonderful ecological church on a bog, the only big bog in southern Ontario. And it's in London. And he will often celebrate Eucharist out there on the bog, so people there, it's a fairly large congregation, will be able to have a wonderful experience of nature and whatnot. Well, he asked me to come and preach, and I did. I went down and I was preaching on the writings of John Moriarty, the ecologist and mystic. And one of the people in the parish, one of the people who was there, was quite anxious. And I said to him something along this, does this bother you? And he says, no, this doesn't bother me. And I'm fed by the Eucharist. What bothers me is my job. And I said, what is your job? He says, I'm the vice president who has to explain why we build the guns that we send to Saudi Arabia. In other words, the big debate in Ottawa about the armaments that we send to Saudi Arabia because of contract purposes, and then the subsequent issues with Saudi Arabia and Yemen and whatnot, has become a great big ethical confrontation in the government. His job as an Anglican is to defend a policy he finds increasingly indefensible. So he's in a constant state of very deep anxiety, because he's very aware of the fact, too, that if they do not honor this contract, or they reduce the number of employers, it won't be just the loss of thousands of jobs, it will be the ripple effect on the social community in that whole area of London. So in other words, things are never easy. Okay, and he, as he wrestles with that moral decision, you realize that he understands the implications of our global interconnectedness, sometimes compromise our national and personal morals. Well, what can you say in terms then of the key things that Greg would have taken from his experience at Louvain, from more importantly his understanding of Catholic social doctrine, from his careful reading of Moses Cody, Jimmy Tompkins, Joel MacDonald, and the other priest prophets of Catholic social doctrine in Eastern Canada? And you can really bring them down to four. I call them the four S's. Okay? The first one is subsidiarity, the second one is socialization, the third one is solidarity, and the fourth one is synodality. Okay? Those are the four S's. But you're probably wondering, what the hell do they mean, right? Well, let me give you a very brief definition of each one of them, and then we can move to summary. Subsidiarity. This principle derives from the experience and vision of an organic society defined as a grave injustice, the transfer of function that can be performed by a subordinate body in society to a higher and larger collectivity. This principle, which Pope Pius XI called fixed and unchangeable, forbade governments to intervene in the running of smaller social units that constituted society, whether of a political, economic, or cultural kind, as long as these bodies were able to look after their needs and provide for adequate self-government. Okay, put simply, the principle of subsidiarity, and originally it was conceived of as a social economic principle. Now in the Catholic Church we also talk about it as a theological principle. But its original gestation in 1931 with Quadragesimo Anno is as a principle of social and political import. It means that an organization which is organic but subordinate within a larger structure should not have its responsibility abrogated by that higher authority. It should solve its problems, work through its challenges at its level. Because when it is absorbed by a higher power, it is rendered powerless in those areas in which it can exercise the appropriate role and right that belongs to it. In other words, it is a significant diminishment of your freedom. Okay? It says, you can't do it, it's going up to us. It's the arrogation, not the abrogation. I said abrogation. Abrogate would be to wipe it out. No, it's the arrogation. It's the assumption of bringing up to a higher level something that could be solved at a lower level to greater effectiveness. Let me give you a perfect example. In a parish, right? You have a parish, and you have the pastor, and then you have all the people living in the parish community. All right. Now, the most important person in the parish is, of course, the cook. All right. Without the cook, there's no fuel. Nothing else works. All right. Now, the cook does not assume that she or he actually exercises that final authority. It is the pastor in the house who does. Now, if the pastor takes over the responsibility of the cook, right, takes on the responsibility of the cook feels diminished, right? The cook is not really called to exercise or realize her vocation as cook, because now the super cook has taken over the role, right? So you have that person feeling diminished. The super cook now has more on his plate than perhaps he had planned, right? And so what happens is you introduce an element of dysfunction into the organic arrangement, okay? because somebody was not respecting the proper sphere of behavior and expectation. All right. That's subsidiarity. Now, Andy Hogan, I mentioned his name before. I think he's an important one. He was a contemporary of Gregg's, early contemporary of Gregg's. He was a MDP member of Parliament for many years until John Paul II decided that no clerics should be involved in political life except him. So, so that's called pontifical fiat. So the Bob Ogle and in the prairies, Bob Drinan in the United States all had to, Ernesto Cardenal in Nicaragua all had to give up their exercise of political ministry because John Paul really wanted to give it his own personal stamp. Anyway, he was a priest of the Archdiocese of Antigonish, like Gregg, but he was from a different part, not from Sydney Mines. He was from a much more exalted area, Glace Bay. And so there were deep socioeconomic tensions clearly between the two of them, but he shared a lot of Andy Hogan's view. And Andy Hogan has a very interesting comment that he made in one of his own writings. He says, the principle of subsidiarity is often forgotten in the church, but it is a key concept. When I was in Parliament, I had the chance to speak to a German Social Democrat and MP. We were talking about the concern shared by all social democratic parties regarding the growth of the big government and impersonal bureaucracies. John Paul II in De Laborem Exercens passes hard judgment on the tremendous bureaucracy that is Eastern European socialism. The MP confided to me that it's feared that in his own country he can see the same tired and depressing reality. But more importantly, perhaps, he acknowledged the importance of the principle of subsidiarity in the social teaching of the Church, and saw in this principle a bulwark against the forms of centralization and big government. He regretted that the principle hadn't been applied hard enough. That's very interesting. So a socialist member of Parliament talking to, and well, a Canadian socialist member of Parliament, finds the Christian or Catholic idea of the principle of subsidiarity. Yeah, that may well work for the Church, but should it not also work in the community and in the government? We're finding this situation right now a source of some peril in the province of Ontario. The current provincial government does not really believe in the principle of subsidiarity in terms of its own cabinet ministers. There's enormous exercise being applied by his chief of staff, Ford's chief of staff, which is a form of tyranny, actually. It's a form of disempowerment of the cabinet ministers. Now, we've seen it before. Stephen Harper did it. Pierre Trudeau, on occasion, did it as well. Jean Chrétien, whom probably many of us like, who was notorious at it. The PMO grew in its power, and the individual members of Parliament and the cabinet ministers had reduced power. And of course, we have this whole crisis with Brexit in Britain right now, where the ministers are really flexing their muscles. So what you see as a counteraction, what you see is when you don't abide by the principle of subsidiarity, when you don't respect the proper right and autonomy and purview of those operating within their spheres, you take it over, you move it up, you arrogate it. What you do, in fact, is you disempower them. You introduce resentment. And worse than resentment, the belief, and we see it all the time, right, in how we live our lives, in business, in government, in the church, the simple conviction, well, it doesn't matter, it's not going to change, there's nothing I can do. A very negative concession to truth. Another key concept then was socialization. What does that mean? The principle of socialization he takes directly from John the 23rd. This principle demanded that smaller social or economic units that were unable to provide adequately for their own needs enter into cooperative relations with others and seek greater coordination of their activities to that together, collectively, they would be able to resolve the problems of all. So socialization results in cooperation, institutional cooperation, intentional cooperation. People coming together and saying, well, we can't do this individually, but maybe we can do it together as a group. You're moving from the individual into community. Does anybody remember the great political figure who said there is no such thing as society? Remember who that was?
No such thing as what?
Who said there was no such thing as society? That's exactly right. It was Maggie Thatcher. Maggie Thatcher. When you come to the conclusion that society doesn't exist, all right, there is no such thing. You're just a concatenation of individuals, each looking for their own thing, and you have to find regulatory ways to make this happen. This all, by the way, coming from a Christian. The Baroness would often take deep exception to the Church of England and to the Kirk because she thought they were intruding, going into areas in which they had no competence. And so she would lecture the prelates, lecture the bishops, because she was a Christian herself. And I often thought, I said, an extraordinary woman of some political insight and economic savvy who had absolutely no understanding of her baptismal promises. I don't know where she was when all these people she's berating were preaching. She seemed to have come at it completely differently. So there is no such thing as a society in Maggie Thatcher's view. My argument would be that's exactly Donald Trump's view. So how do you work against that? You work against it by building up cooperation, and that's the principle of socialization. The principle of solidarity, briefly put, John Paul II, it's his idea, by the way. You know, I can be fairly critical of John Paul II, particularly in light of his ecclesiology and historical perspectives on many things. But on Catholic social doctrine, he is one of the great giants. In fact, no one has achieved a more effective and organic collection of documents that we can legitimately call Catholic social doctrine than John Paul II. And they were Laborem Exercens, Solicitudo Rei Socialis, and Centissimus Annus. Those are the three corner documents, each one worth 2 or 3 doctorates. Right? Very powerful works. And in one of them, called Solicitudo Dei Socialis, he says, solidarity is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of so many people, both near and far. On the contrary, it is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, to the good of all and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for each other. That's the principle of solidarity. The principle, the final S, so we've gone through a number of them, subsidiarity, socialization, and the solidarity. The last one is synodality, and synodality is very recent. And Greg wouldn't have been around for it as it was finding its articulation, but it's certainly a view that he would have added to his own lexicon. Synodality is the practical expression of the participation of the local church in the governance of the universal church through deliberative bodies. Well, those of you in the room who are Roman Catholic will understand only too clearly what that means. The church, particularly in the United States, but I would suggest not exclusively, is in the process of significant meltdown. I've been following the church for a number of years. I'm a committed Catholic myself, but I've been following the church for a number of years as a commentator, written scores of books, and I've never seen anything like it. We're in a time of dissolution, and we're in a time of reformation, actually. Does not Pope Francis understands it's not a matter of tinkering with renewal. It's a matter of reform. Now, we shouldn't be alarmed by this, folks. You know, people say, oh my God, everything's going to hell in a handbasket. If you know your history, you will know that that's not the case. There are always cycles in which the church undergoes a violent internal experience of renewal, okay, and reform. In fact, the great phrase, Ecclesia semper reformanda, church ever reforming, would indicate that at no time do we ever exhaust the demands that we have on us to approximate the charisms of the gospel. We fail, and we fail many times. But there come certain moments when the pathologies of the institutions and the pathologies of our spirit are such and in dramatic alignment that things simply aren't working at all. Okay? And I suggest to you that that's exactly where we are now. So the principle of synodality can be a very important principle if it's implemented right across the system to bring Christians, by virtue of their baptism, to be co-creators and sharers in the making of a more vital and credible church. This is clearly what Francis has in mind. Okay? But structures never change. with alacrity, right? They're never accelerated things because they do violence to the organic sensorium, all right? So we have change slowly and gradually, but sometimes it can't be that gradual. The consequences would be deleterious. You had an example when we had a presidential seminar on the weekend. We have a number of our faculty who we take for 15 months. We take them through something called the Catholic Intellectual Tradition. And they're people who study with me and with somebody else, and special guests that we bring in, a Thomist, an Augustinian, whatever, we bring them in to talk about Augustine and Aquinas and all this. And there are people who are our faculty, and they could be in physician training, could be the health faculty, they could be exercise science, they could be actuaries in the business building and marketing and whatnot, all different faiths, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, Sufi, Sikh, all over, okay? And but the one thing they have in common is they want to know something about what it means to be a Catholic university. What is the meaning of a Catholic intellectual tradition, and what are the things that they can learn that can enrich their own tradition and that reciprocity? Well, it goes on for a long time, and we've now had over 100 some graduates of our faculty who have gone through this process. And one of the things is learning the language and learning the history and learning or disabusing people of notions that the current moment has never happened before. It's like those people who are always talking about the end days. And as you know in the scriptures right now, with Christ the King coming up and with the most recent readings from the book of Daniel and the book of Revelations, we're all talking about the end days. Well, the end days come every year. Okay, the end days come every year. Millenarians are with us all the time. People are always expecting that the judgment of the Lord is going to be severe, and the Tumma Mairum is going to be sounded late this afternoon. So we've had apocalyptists and millenarians doing this for a long time, right? And you remember the last big moment was the year 2000, right? So we were all worried about that. So we do this. We build up these anxieties. We think everything's going to come to wreck and ruin, and then out of that will come a new creation. It never works that way. But what we do become increasingly aware of is that the changes in our technological society don't allow for the slow, gradual assimilation of new knowledge. Everything moves at an accelerated rate. And so some of these principles we're talking about here have to be modified to some degree to deal with the new technological reality. We all know this, right? You're working on your computer. I find this regularly, and I used to find it when I was president of St. Jerome's University. I mean, I was president of the university that we had quantum computing chair, we had a chair in combinatorics, we had the guy cryptography, who was the top cryptologist for MasterCard all over the world. And then we had all the, because of our relationship with the University of Waterloo, we produced more people for Silicon Valley and Bill Gates than any other university, including Stanford. Okay? So we're doing this all the time. And what I would find, and you were forced into this, I mean, it was a big shock to me to have to give up the quill. And then I had to give up the chalk. And the loss of the chalk dust was devastating to me. Okay, so I'm adjusting all the time, trying to figure out how I'm going to do this. I have to write these books. I have to write them in a different way and everything else. And then I discovered, I came back to my office just a couple of months ago, and there's a guy there from IT, and they all look the same way, right? Yeah, the IT guys, they all have this incredibly soldierly intensity about them, and they're a general incomprehension that you don't know what they're talking about. But some still relative respect for your rank that they don't actually say, "You're an idiot, sir." So they hold that back, but it's clear in their eyes. That's what they think, right? So they say, "Well, it's time to upgrade your program." Upgrade the program? Well, I just took me 2 years to get used to the old program. Now I've got all different kinds of icons, and where something said forward, it's not there anymore. Now it's got a different name, and so you're in a constant process of reacclimating, right? Whereas the younger ones, the process is expedited by the fact of their general familiarity with the tools, right? So the process of adjusting, acceleration, disruption is enormous for all of us. So if we keep in mind some of these principles, you can see how Gregg was doing the same thing. Gregg was not a Luddite. He didn't despair of technology. He tried to understand it. He didn't despair of big business. He tried to make sure that small business, that which was small, would have its role to play in the larger economic mosaic, and that the extirpation of the small would be to the delimitation of that larger economic impulse. That we have to work together and to celebrate together, and there has to be a festive element in this. I think I never talked to him about this, but I would think the book that was probably most important in shaping his philosophy and attitude toward life was the book by Josef Pieper, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. I think this has got to be the core book. It's got the right values, the right approach to all of this. Right? So I think by way of summary then, what kind of a guy was Gregg? Working well all these principles, and he was a practical man too. He was a thinker, but he was a practical man. He wouldn't be going out giving talks to groups and saying, okay, we're going to sit down and talk about subsidiarity from 1931 to because he knew he would lose his audience. He didn't talk about subsidiarity, he implemented it. He didn't talk about socialization, he enacted it. Right? So amidst that wonderful intellectual formation, and he wasn't intellectual. I mean, he wasn't a well-published scholar or anything like that, because that didn't matter to him. That didn't matter to him. What mattered was the other. So at the end, there's a lovely passage by John Williams, who was for many years an ethicist. I think he was a bioethicist, but he eventually seemed to have become a social ethicist as well. John Williams says something at the end of one of these chapters here, which I thought was quite brilliant, because it really, he doesn't apply it, but I think it can apply to Gregg. What is a social justice Christian? Well, Williams says he is one who has agreed that religious morality should deal not just with the actions of individuals toward other individuals, but also with the actions of groups of people towards other groups. Politicians and voters, unions and management, corporations and consumers, and many actions which were formerly considered to be beyond the scope of religious morality, such as political and economic activities, are now regarded as matters of church concern, just as much as lying, stealing, and killing between individuals. According to this view of morality, many aspects of our political and economic system are intrinsically unjust because they are harmful to certain human beings, especially the poor and otherwise disadvantaged. No amount of individual moral rectitude can overcome these structural defects of our society. End of quote. Well, the kind of social justice Christian John Williams is describing is, in fact, Gregg MacLeod. He was a social justice Christian. He was an animator. He was a thinker. But he was what the Irish call an anam cara. An anam cara in the Celtic spirituality is a soul companion, a spiritual brother who is with you, who accompanies you. Doesn't pontificate, more often listens, tries to find some direction, right? Observes. I think that's how he exercised his priestly ministry, as an anam cara. But most importantly, too, he was a local iteration to the universal call to holiness. He didn't have to sit down and take out the Vatican Council documents, or indeed the various encyclicals that appeared in the several decades following the Council, to make his point. I suspect he read them, and I suspect he shelved them, because he understood what was more important is not the seminar or the master's thesis, but the realization through group action, through cooperatives, through the building of a humane social economic order, bringing people together, helping them to understand who they are, exercising a preferential option for the poor, and making them proud to be Cape Bretoners. Bringing all those things together is no easy feat, but I think it was the narrative of his life. And I suspect in no small way, like Henry Nouwen once said, the fertility or the fecundity of your life is never found in what you do, but only after your death, when people discover what you have done. Thank you.